She was a ghost in a machine built for titans. Her name was Alara, and her domain was the quiet hum of logistics, the silent language of inventory manifests and calibration sequences. She moved through the gleaming halls of the Ares proving grounds like a whisper, her plain gray fatigues a stark contrast to the polished chrome and holographic displays that surrounded her. Ares was a temple dedicated to the future of warfare, a place where the air itself smelled of ozone, ambition, and burnt cordite. The men and women who walked its ranges were the new gods of ballistics, their sponsored gear shining under the perpetual glare of high-intensity lights. They were sculpted, confident, and loud. Alara was none of those things. She was small, her features unremarkable, her presence so understated that she could stand in a room for an hour before anyone noticed she was there. Her only distinguishing feature was the object holstered on her hip. It was an anachronism, a piece of history in a place that worshipped the future. A Kestrel M29 revolver. It was a heavy, brutish piece of steel and wood, its blued finish worn to a soft gray at the edges from decades of use. Compared to the sleek, polymer-framed, optics-ready sidearms worn by everyone else, it was a fossil, a relic, and it was the source of unending, quiet ridicule. The Titans of Ares did not speak to her directly, not at first. They spoke around her, their voices sharp and clear in the cavernous spaces of the facility. They were a coterie of mockers, a pack that ran together, led by their alpha. Kalen Vance was the king of Ares. His face was on the recruiting posters, his name attached to every base record worth holding. He was handsome, arrogant, and possessed a preternatural talent with a rifle. His ego was as vast and sterile as the desert that surrounded the proving grounds. He was flanked always by his two chief sycophants, Jax, a tech-obsessed shooter whose rifle looked more like a server rack, and Lyra, a competitor whose tongue was sharper than any bayonet. They were the in-group, the polished elite, and their world was one of high-dollar sponsorships and casual cruelty. The first direct confrontation was as banal as it was inevitable. Alara was on range 7, kneeling, her focus entirely on the delicate task of recalibrating a long-range atmospheric sensor. Her worn toolkit was laid out on a mat with the precision of a surgeon's instruments. Vance and his crew swept onto the range, their laughter echoing off the blast shields. They were there to shoot, to make noise, to remind everyone of their dominance. Jax was the first to spot her. He stopped, his grin widening into a predatory sneer. "Well, look what we have here. The janitors come to play." Lyra let out a theatrical sigh. "Don't be rude, Jax. She's logistics." Her eyes dropped to the revolver on Alara's hip. "What is that thing, a museum piece? You planning on fighting the last war?" Vance chuckled, a low, condescending sound. He didn't even look at Alara, instead addressing the empty range downfield. "Careful, Lyra. That probably belonged to her grandfather. Probably won it in a bar fight." Alara did not look up. Her hands moved with an unwavering, economical grace, her fingers tracing the fine wires of the sensor array. She made a final adjustment with a specialized screwdriver, her touch as delicate as a watchmaker's. The diagnostic panel next to her flickered from amber to a steady, solid green. Her work was done. She said nothing. She simply packed her tools, each one clicking softly into its designated slot. Her silence was a fortress. It was a vacuum that their insults could not fill, and it infuriated them. She rose, gave a perfunctory nod to the empty space in their general direction as required by base protocol, and walked away. The incident solidified her status. She was no longer just the quiet logistics tech. She became the ghost with a relic. The mockery, once whispered, became a performance. It started in the mess hall. Alara would sit alone, as she always did, eating her meal with the same quiet efficiency she applied to her work. Jax and Lyra would take a table nearby, their voices deliberately loud, their laughter sharp. "I heard the ghost gun is so old, it fires with black powder," Jax would announce to his audience. "They say if you put your ear to it, You can still hear the cavalry charge, Lyra would retort to a fresh round of Snickers. Then came the social media pool. Jax created a private group for the elite shooters at Ares, calling it the Kestrel Flop. The betting was simple. Members would wager on which day Illyra's ancient revolver would finally have a catastrophic failure during a routine weapons check. Screenshots of her from a distance, the heavy Kestrel a dark shape on her hip, were posted with mocking captions. Antique Roadshow, Firing Range Edition. Betting at jams on the third round. Any takers? The group gained dozens of members. It was a running joke, a way for them to reinforce their own superiority by tearing down the outlier. Illyra knew. She saw the smirks, the phones angled to take a quick photo as she passed. She heard the fragments of their jokes. She did nothing. Her expression remained a mask of placid neutrality. Laugh now. You won't soon. The cruelty escalated when Vance decided to lend his official weight to the harassment. During a mandatory range safety briefing for all personnel, he stood at the podium, the very picture of authority and competence. He covered the standard protocols, then paused, letting his gaze sweep across the assembled shooters and support staff. His eyes landed on Illyra, who stood near the back, perfectly still. A final note on equipment, Vance said, his voice ringing with condescending authority. We are here to test the future of ballistics. We push the envelope of what is possible. That requires modern, reliable, and appropriate hardware. He paused for effect. We are not here to indulge historical reenactments. Some equipment, regardless of sentimental value, simply does not belong on a professional range. It is a liability to the shooter and to everyone around them. He didn't use her name. He didn't have to. Every eye in the room flickered toward Illyra. The message was clear. You do not belong here. Your legacy is worthless. Illyra's jaw did not tighten. Her gaze did not waver. She simply stood, absorbing the collective weight of their scorn, her face as impassive as stone. The final piece of the trap was set with the announcement of the Longshot Invitational. It was the biggest event of the year, a competition that came with a lucrative defense contract for the winner and their sponsors. To even compete, shooters had to pass a notoriously difficult preliminary qualification test. Illyra walked into the administration office and quietly added her name to the sign-up sheet. She used a plain black pen, her signature a neat, compact script. Illyra Vance, Logistics Division, Service Weapon, Kestrel M29. The administrative clerk looked at the entry, then at her, his expression a mixture of pity and disbelief. Word spread like wildfire. The ghost was actually going to try to qualify. The Kestrel Flop betting pool exploded with activity. The news reached the range master, a man named Marcus Thorne. Thorne was a corrupt gatekeeper, a petty tyrant who owed his comfortable position to Kalen Vance's influence. He saw Illyra's name on the list and smiled. This was an opportunity. He made 2 calls. The first was to the scheduling office. He had Illyra assigned the very last qualification slot of the day, 4:30 in the afternoon, when the desert sun would be a blinding, merciless glare hanging low in the west, directly in the shooter's eyes. A significant, but plausibly deniable, disadvantage. The second was to the munitions depot. On qualification day, Illyra arrived at the check-in desk and presented her equipment for inspection. Thorne himself was manning the station, a rare occurrence. He inspected the Kestrel with a theatrical slowness, turning it over in his hands as if it were a strange and unclean object. An interesting choice, technician, he said, his voice dripping with false pleasantry. He then turned to the small, unassuming wooden box she carried with her. It contained her ammunition. Each of the 50 cartridges was hand-loaded, the brass polished to a soft gleam, the projectiles seated with microscopic precision. They were her father's recipe, a specific grain weight and powder load calibrated perfectly for the Kestrel's unique rifling. Thorne opened the box, peered inside, and then shut it with a decisive snap. "I'm sorry," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. These rounds are not on the approved list for range use. Unauthorized custom loads. They are registered, Alara stated, her voice flat and even. I filed the ballistics data sheet last week. Thorne feigned a look of surprise. Must have gotten lost in the system. A real shame. He pushed the box back towards her, then gestured to a crate of standard issue 44 Magnum rounds. You'll have to use these. Base regulations. For safety, of course. It was a deliberate act of sabotage. The factory-loaded ammunition was generic, powerful, but inconsistent. In the Kestrel, it would produce a greater recoil, a dirtier burn, and a significant deviation in accuracy at any real distance. It was designed to make her fail. Thorne sealed her ammunition box with evidence tape. We'll hold on to this. Can't have potential hazards on the line. He knew what he was doing. Vance knew what he was doing. They were not just trying to make her lose. They were trying to break her. Alara looked at the box of standard rounds, then at Thorne's smug face. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. She took the box of inferior ammunition without a word and proceeded to her assigned lane. They think they can break me. They'll learn. The afternoon heat was oppressive. The sun, just as Thorne had planned, was a molten disk hanging directly over the distant targets. Heat shimmered off the concrete, distorting the air, turning the range into a wavering, uncertain landscape. The other shooters had all finished, their results posted on the main holographic display. Vance was at the top, his score near perfect. Now, only one name remained on the list, Alara Vance. The gallery was full. Jax and Lyra stood with Vance, their arms crossed, smirks plastered on their faces. The members of the Kestrel flop were there, phones out, ready to document the inevitable, humiliating failure. This was the grand finale of their long-running joke. Alara stood at the firing line, lane 7, a lone figure against the vastness of the desert. She loaded 6 of the standard-issue cartridges into the Kestrel cylinder. The action was thick and clumsy compared to her own smooth brass. She could feel the subtle wrongness of it, the slight imbalance. As she stood ready, waiting for the signal, Kalen Vance walked past her, pausing just behind her shoulder. He leaned in, his voice a venomous whisper meant only for her. You know, my father used to talk about your dad. Said he was a legend, a real shooter from a different time. He let the words hang in the air. He'd be ashamed to see his legacy reduced to this. A joke with a rusty cannon, trying to play with the big boys. You're disgracing his memory. That was it. That was the line. It was no longer about her pride. It was about a legacy she carried in her bones, a promise made to a dying man. Her expression did not change. But in the quiet stillness of her mind, a switch was thrown. A decision was made. Thorne's voice crackled over the loudspeaker. Shooter, the line is hot. Your target is at 500 yards. On my mark. The steel plate at 500 yards was a difficult shot, the standard for qualification. Alara ignored it. She turned her head slightly, her gaze falling upon the lane control panel next to her. It was an advanced piece of tech, a touchscreen interface for setting target distances and running diagnostics. Her fingers, nimble and sure from thousands of hours of technical work, flew across the screen. She tapped in an administrative override code, a backdoor command known only to senior logistics personnel. The system beeped, granting her access. She bypassed the standard qualification protocol. She inputted a new command, a new distance. Out on the range, the quiet hum of the targeting rig deepened into a low growl. Heavy electric motors engaged. The target carrier at 500 yards began to move. It slid backward past the 600-yard marker, past the 800. It kept going. The digital display above her lane, which had read 500 YDES, began to spin, the numbers climbing rapidly. 700, 900, 1,200. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. What is she doing? The target carrier finally came to a stop at a distance that seemed impossible. The display locked, the numbers glowing a stark, defiant red. 1,500 yards. Thorne's voice, now panicked and furious, blasted from the speakers. "Technician Vance, what are you doing? Cease. That is not the qualification protocol. Return the target to 500 yards immediately." Vance, who had been watching with a predatory smirk, now burst into open, incredulous laughter. "A comedy show," he bellowed to his friends. "She's finally cracked. 1,000-yard stare and a 1,500-yard target. This is better than I ever imagined." The crowd buzzed, a mixture of confusion and derisive amusement. It was a gesture of sheer insanity. A revolver at 1,500 yards was not marksmanship. It was a prayer to the god of random chance. Alara ignored them all. The jeers, the orders, the laughter, it was all just noise. She let out a slow, controlled breath, the desert air hot in her lungs. The sun was a searing white disk, its glare reflecting off every surface. She faced the target, a tiny speck of steel nearly a mile away, shimmering and dancing in the heat haze. Then she did something that silenced the entire gallery. She closed her eyes. For a full 10 seconds, she stood perfectly still, eyes shut, as if listening to something no one else could hear. She was feeling the world, the faint tremor of the ground beneath her boots, the inconsistent whisper of the wind, tugging first from the left, then from the right, the oppressive weight of the heat and humidity. She was building a firing solution in her mind, a complex, intuitive equation of physics and instinct. "I didn't come to win. I came to show them who I am." Her eyes opened. They were clear, calm, and utterly focused. In a single, fluid motion, a movement so smooth it seemed to bend time, she drew the kestrel. She raised it, not with the two-handed, braced grip of a modern shooter, but with one hand. Her arm extended, locking at the elbow, the heavy revolver becoming a seamless extension of her will. The stance was alien. It was old. It was something no one at Ares had ever seen before. She did not seem to aim, not in the traditional sense. There was no careful alignment of sights, no minute adjustments. She simply raised the weapon, her head tilted slightly, her body a statue of perfect balance. She knew where the bullet would go. The first shot cracked the air. It was not the synthetic pop of the rifles they were used to. It was a deep, resonant boom, a thunderclap that rolled across the desert and echoed back from the distant mountains. The recoil, amplified by the ill-suited ammunition, kicked the barrel up violently. But her arm absorbed it, her body flowing with the force, bringing the weapon back on target in an instant. A full second of ringing silence passed. Then another. Then, faint and clear, a sound traveled back across the mile of scorched earth. Ping. The unmistakable sound of a copper-jacketed projectile hitting hardened steel. On the holographic display above her lane, a single word flashed in green. Bullseye. The laughter in the gallery died. The smirks evaporated. A profound, absolute silence fell over the Ares proving grounds. Vance's face went slack, his jaw hanging open. Jax and Lyra stared, their eyes wide with disbelief. Thorn, in the control tower, froze with his hand on the microphone button. Alara did not pause. Shot 2. Same rhythm. Same impossible, one-handed stance. The thunderclap. The recoil. The agonizing weight. Ping. Bullseye. Shot 3. Ping. Bullseye. Shot 4. Ping. Bullseye. It was a cadence of destruction, a rhythmic dismantling of everything they thought they knew about shooting. She was not just hitting the target. She was performing surgery at a distance they considered impossible with a rifle, let alone a revolver. Shot 5. Ping. Bullseye. 1 round left in the cylinder. She paused, holding the aim for an extra half-second. The final shot rang out. Ping. Bullseye. 6 shots. 6 bullseyes. The display beside her lane updated, showing a magnified view of the target. There was no grouping to speak of. There was only a single, ragged hole in the dead center of the steel plate, the metal warped and torn from 6 consecutive impacts in the exact same spot. Up in the VIP observation deck, a place of quiet privilege far above the noise of the range, an old man lowered a pair of powerful binoculars from his eyes. He was General Irons, a living legend, a man who had seen more combat than anyone at Ares had seen years of life. His aide stood beside him, speechless. Irons' voice was a low, reverent whisper, thick with awe. "The phantom stance," he breathed. "And 6 for 6. I've only ever heard stories." Down on a range floor, a few of the older veterans heard the whisper from the comms, or perhaps they simply recognized the impossible when they saw it. The name spread through the crowd like a shockwave. Phantom, that was Unit Meridian's signature. Dr. Eris Thorne, a brilliant civilian ballistics engineer and no relation to the corrupt rangemaster, was staring at his data tablet, his face pale. He was watching the telemetry feed from the target's sensors. It's not possible," he muttered to his assistant. "The grouping is sub-MOA, at 1,500 yards, with a revolver. Factoring in windage, Coriolis effect, the ballistic coefficient of a .44 Magnum. The physics are wrong. This is impossible." Alara lowered the Kestrel, the barrel smoking in hot air. She broke open the action and calmly ejected the 6 spent casings, their brass ends blackened by the force of their firing. She moved with the unhurried grace of someone who had just finished a routine task. The silence of the crowd was a physical thing, a heavy blanket of shock and awe. Then, a movement broke the spell. The door to the VIP deck opened, and General Irons began to descend the metal staircase to the range floor. It was a stunning breach of protocol. No one challenged him. He walked with a purpose that parted the stunned crowd like a ship's bow through water. He walked straight to Alara, who was now calmly reloading her revolver with the standard-issue rounds, as if preparing for another volley. The 4-star general stopped directly in front of the quiet logistics technician. He did not speak. He simply came to attention, his back ramrod straight. He raised his hand in a slow, perfect salute. He held it, his eyes fixed on hers, an expression of profound, unwavering respect on his weathered face. The entire base, the elite shooters, the technicians, the administrators, even Thorne in his tower, watched this icon of the military salute a woman they had all dismissed as a joke. Kalen Vance's face was ashen. The world he had built, a world with him at the apex, had just been shattered into a million pieces. He finally found his voice, a stammering, desperate whisper. "Meridian. She's not logistics. She's former Unit Meridian." General Irons lowered his salute, but his gaze did not leave Alara. Then he turned his head, and his eyes, cold as chips of ice, pinned Kalen Vance where he stood. "Her name is Alara." The general's voice was quiet, but it carried across the silent range with the force of a hammer blow. "And you are not fit to speak the name of her former unit." He took a step closer to Kalen, his voice dropping even lower. "That Kestrel, you told everyone it was your father's. Another lie to build your pathetic myth." He looked from the gun back to Kalen's terrified face. "It belonged to Sergeant Major Elias Vance, your older brother." A tremor went through Kalen. "You told the recruitment board he died in a training accident." Irons continued, his voice relentless. "He didn't. He was the founder and sole operator of Unit Meridian, the greatest phantom soldier this country has ever known. And when he was dying, he left that weapon, his legacy, to the only one he trusted to carry it." Irons raised a hand and pointed a single, trembling finger at Alara. He left it to his daughter. The final piece clicked into place. The name on the sign-up sheet. Alara Vance. Kalen Vance's carefully constructed world did not just shatter. It imploded, leaving nothing but a vacuum of shame. The lie he had built his entire career on, that he was the sole heir to a legendary shooting family, was exposed. He was a fraud, and his forgotten, ridiculed niece was the true inheritor of the gift. He stumbled backward, his face a mask of horror and disbelief. His sponsors, who had been standing near him, began to quietly edge away, their faces grim. Jax and Lyra just stared, their mouths agape, the sheer scale of their miscalculation rendering them completely inert. Marcus Thorne, in the tower, saw the way things were going and tried to sidle away from the control panel. He found his path blocked by two stone-faced military police officers. They didn't speak. They just stood there. The crowd's reaction shifted again. The phones that had been out to film a failure were now recording a legend. The whispers of Phantom Stance and Unit Meridian turned into a low roar of reverence. The ghost was gone. In her place stood the heir to a myth. Dr. Eris Thorne, the ballistics engineer, was the first to approach her, moving with a hesitant, respectful energy. He held up his tablet, the screen filled with incomprehensible data streams. "Miss Vance," he began, his voice shaky with excitement. "The telemetry it's revolutionary. The way you compensate for harmonic resonance and Coriolis drift in real time. It's not in any textbook. It's not in any computer model. It's intuitive. Would you be willing to teach me?" The foremost expert on ballistics at Ares was now the humble student. Alara looked at him, her expression softening for the first time that day. She gave a small, simple nod. A younger shooter, a nervous kid named Ben who had always been too intimidated to speak to the elite, stepped forward. He had watched the entire display with wide, adoring eyes. He wordlessly knelt and began picking up the 6 spent shell casings Alara had ejected. He polished them on his sleeve and held them out to her in his cupped hands, a sacred offering. Alara took them, her fingers brushing his. It was a transfer of something unspoken. Respect. Hope. A legacy passed on. The consequences for the arrogant were swift and brutal. Kalen Vance's downfall was total. His sponsorships, worth millions, evaporated in a series of terse press releases before the sun had even set. The military contract he had been banking on was immediately put on review. A formal investigation was launched into his service record, specifically the falsified reports surrounding his brother's history. He was stripped of his titles and records. The last anyone saw of him, he was leaving the base in a generic sedan, no entourage, no cameras, just a broken man swallowed by the desert. Marcus Thorne was dishonorably discharged and faced federal charges for dereliction of duty and the deliberate endangerment of personnel. Jax and Lyra were reassigned to a remote logistics depot in the Aleutian Islands, their careers in elite marksmanship permanently finished. They were condemned to a life of counting crates in the freezing cold. Alara, in contrast, was offered the world. Commands, endorsements, the lead role in the military's top competitive team. She turned it all down. She accepted a single offer, a chief consultant position with the company that won the long-shot contract. She took it on one condition. She would run a small, specialized training program on a forgotten range on the far side of the base. No press, no fame, just work. The legend of the Kestrel at 1,500 yards became a foundational myth at Ares. Range 7 was unofficially renamed the Phantom Range. New recruits were not shown the videos of Kalen Vance's perfect scores anymore. They were shown the grainy phone footage of a lone woman with a revolver, defying physics and humbling the proud. It was taught as a lesson. Humility is the greatest weapon. Alara's new training program had no official name, but the students called it the Ghost School. It was impossible to get into. Selection wasn't based on scores or records, but on character. She chose the quiet ones, the underestimated, the ones with heart but not polish. Her first student was Ben, the boy who had picked up her spent casings. He, and others like him, became the next generation of legends, taught that the spirit of the shooter was more important than the brand of their weapon. Alara herself returned to the quiet. She was a mentor now, a silent guide. Her Kestrel, the relic that had been a symbol of their ridicule, now sat in a simple glass case at the entrance to the new training facility. It was a permanent reminder gleaming under a single spotlight. A reminder that true strength doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need to be new. It just needs to be true.